Good morning, everybody. It's time for us to start. The lesson sheets, if you don't already have one, there should be some in the back, both for today's lesson, which is going to be about Samson's mom. We don't know her name, but we'll talk about her, and then Samson's fiance, and then next Sunday it'll be about Delilah, who is another influential person in Samson's life. So as we've been doing this quarter, talking about the influence of a woman. Some of the examples we've seen have been good influence, and then some have been bad influences. But what we're trying to do is note a few things about how women use their influence, how women should be aware of how influential they are, how men should be aware of the influence of a woman, and then also picking up hopefully a little bit more appreciation for these Bible characters and the fact that these were real people who had their own strengths and weaknesses, who had their struggles, who sometimes succumbed to their weaknesses and sometimes overcame their weaknesses, and what we can gather from their examples. We noted that women are uniquely influential, and we're going to see some of that today, and we're also going to see some of the limitations of a woman's influence today. So we're going to be in Judges chapter 13 and 14. And of course, we get to the book of Judges. We're skipping ahead from where we were last Sunday when we talked about, what was her name? In Jericho. Rahab, thank you. Yeah, Rahab and her influence. So that was during the conquest of the land of Canaan. And then by now, we get to the book of Judges. We're skipping ahead. We don't know exactly how long. Judges period lasts for a couple hundred years. Sometime in that period of Judges lived Samson. And so recall that in the book of Judges, we see a pattern develop among God's people. And the pattern is they will fall away from God and they'll go into idol worship, or they'll just neglect God entirely. And then God allows these people who lived in the land, who weren't the Israelites, who Israel did not fully push out of the promised land, these people remained, and they start to oppress God's people. And God's people call out to God. They turn back to him. He sends someone to deliver them. And then we have this period of peace that follows. And the pattern repeats. Now, Samson is unique because it doesn't fall neatly into that pattern. Anyone pick up any differences with Samson's story from that pattern? Starting in chapter 13, it reads 13 verse 1. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. And then verse 2, immediately, and there was a certain man of Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and he bore no children. We're not going to talk, the focus of this lesson is not about Samson. It's about the women in his life. But I will note that in this case, he is not going to lead a return to the Lord in this instance. We're not going to see this turning of God's people back to God. If it happens through the life of Samson, it's not revealed in the text. And the other thing we're going to see is he does not completely deliver God's people from the Philistines here. He's fighting in a very localized part of the kingdom. This is the tribe of Dan. So it's not like he's going to lead an army that's going to push the Philistines out of God's people. And it's not like he's going to serve as a judge in the traditional sense where he's providing guidance to God's people. Samson's really different from the other judges. And it almost seems as if God is allowing Samson to follow his own personal interests in his life, and it just happens to coincide that what Samson wants to do is kill Philistines. And God is allowing that, providing for that. But other than that, Samson's not going to do a lot of things that a traditional leader, especially one of God's leaders, is going to do. Okay. So we're introduced to this new character Manoah, in verse 2, and his wife is barren. Have we seen this before? A barren woman who's going to have an important role? Yeah, we keep seeing this. So who have we talked about so far that was noted to be barren? Sarah, Rachel. Who else? Hannah is one that we're not going to talk about, but it's going to come up. An important story, very similar in that we have this woman who was barren, and she waits a very long time for a child. And God is going to give her a child, and the child is going to be important to completing God's will. Other ones aside from Hannah that we might look ahead to? Elizabeth, excellent, yeah. She was old when she was promised a child, and of course that was John the Baptist. Others you can think of? Rachel was barren for a long time before she had Joseph. So this is something that we're seeing, and obviously a lot of times back in this day when women are barren, they just never had kids. That's just what happened. But in these stories, there's usually a woman who wants to have kids and can't, and then eventually they go to God and they are promised a child, and the child turns out being important. But here, we don't get any indication that Manoah's wife prays for a child, just that she was barren. And then I'm going to cover the facts like we've been doing, just kind of go through the facts of the story, and then we'll go through the questions. And we'll pick up right there. Verse 3, an angel of the Lord appears to her, not to her and her husband, but just to her. And she's given some instructions. Well, she's told she's going to have a child, and she's given some instructions both for her own behavior, what she's supposed to do. And what is that? What does the angel tell her she's going to have to do? Yeah, no strong drink. Yeah, and it's some of the elements of this Nazirite vow that she's going to have to take on during the pregnancy. And then what are the instructions for her son once he's born? No razors touch his head, right? He's going to be a Nazirite according to what the angel tells her about what she's supposed to do with her son. Right. Yeah, no unclean for her and no strong drink, right? So when we go back and we look at what the Nazirite vow was about, it's discussed in Numbers chapter 6. And from verse 2 to verse 21, it gives all the rules to be a Nazirite. Now, it looks like from that reading that this Nazirite vow was for a limited period of time, where individually, if you decided you wanted to do this, you made a vow to God and you did it for a set duration. What's different about Samson was she's told his is going to be from birth to death. He's going to live his whole life as a Nazirite. And that seems to be very different from what the Nazirite vow usually involved. And so there's a lot of rules about doing this because it involves devoting yourself to God and denying yourself from things that weren't sinful, like you couldn't eat grapes as a Nazirite. You couldn't come in contact with a dead body as a Nazirite. It's not sinful to do those things as a child of God, but you had to avoid those things as a Nazirite. So Samson, it's interesting. He's going to be around a lot of dead bodies because he's going to be killing a lot of people. And there's set rules for a Nazirite. If even for a short period of time, someone died near you unexpectedly, you had to go and shave your head and start over again if that occurred during the time of your Nazirite vow. We don't get any indication that Samson does anything like that, except he didn't cut his hair. We know for sure he didn't cut his hair. Otherwise, we don't have really any clue that he kept the Nazirite vow. But that was something that he did keep, and God expected him to keep because his strength was tied to it. One more thing I'll speculate on before we go on. We, in kids' stories, in kids' Bible books, and even in little dolls that we create of Samson, how does Samson look when he's represented in pictures? Yeah, muscle bound is what I'm thinking of. They always show him as this really, bulky guy. He looks like a wrestler. Great big guy. Is there any indication in the scripture that that's what he looked like? They don't describe him, so we don't know. But it seems to me that his strength came from God, not from his muscles. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if he looked like a regular guy who just had the power of God put upon him at times, because that's where his strength lied. It didn't lie in his muscles. It lied in God giving him special strength. So it seems to me more realistic that you would not maybe have thought about him as being a strong guy until he acts, and then he's busting down city gates, and he's killing 30 men here and 1,000 men over here. But again, that's speculation. We don't get the idea from the text of anything about his physical appearance. But it does seem to me that when we show him as a muscle-bound character in these kids' books, that we're maybe stressing the wrong thing to the kids. It wasn't his strength, it was God's strength that was doing these things. Okay. Well, back to the story. I'll keep going through the facts here so we can get to the questions. So the angel appears to Miss Manoah, gives her the instructions for her and for the boy she's about to have. And she goes and tells her husband about the message. He, as a result of that, goes to God in prayer and asks that the messenger come again, because he has questions about what they're supposed to do with this boy, about what his vocation is going to be. He needs to know more. So he prays to God, and God grants him another visit. But again, Miss Manoah is out in a field without Manoah, and the messenger comes to her again, doesn't come to Manoah. She leaves the angel in the field. She goes and gets her husband. She comes back, and then the husband gets to ask his questions. Does the angel give any new information on the second visit? He repeats the exact same thing. And so the husband says, well, what about his vocation? What kind of person he's supposed to be? What are we supposed to do? And the angel says, let your wife pay attention, like he's reprimanding the wife. She didn't have questions. But he says, and he just goes over again the requirements, very brief bit of information. It seems like Manoah, maybe, first-time dad, he may be excited about having a child, but he's the kind that maybe a little bit anxious. He wants to know more. Well, how's this going to work? What are we supposed to do? And he pushes to try to get that information. He doesn't get anything new. He tries to be hospitable to this messenger of God and wants to prepare a meal. The angel of the Lord declines to eat, but says, but if you want to offer a burnt offering, that would be acceptable. So Manoah goes through the process of offering the burnt offering, meat and grain, and when the flame goes up from the sacrifice, the angel of the Lord goes up in the flame. And at that moment, they realize this is more than just a messenger of God. This is, I think from the text, it seems like they understood this was God who visited them. It wasn't just some prophet. Manoah's reaction to this event is what? Falls to the ground. And what do you think is going to happen next? Yeah, his expectation is, we've seen God, now we're going to die. That was not an unusual response at this time. Everyone believed that if you saw God directly, you would die. We see that in Gideon's story. So here, he reacts, worst case scenario, to this event. And what's Manoah's wife's comment in response to Manoah's reaction? She seems to reason with him that if God wanted us dead, he would have already killed us. And why would he have given us all this information about the son we're going to have if he's just going to kill us? It seems that she just kind of reasons out why his concerns are unfounded. Skip ahead. Samson is born. God is with him. Spirit of the Lord, it says, starts to move within him. And that gets us to the end of chapter 13. Okay, again, that's just the facts so far. Any facts that I've left out that we need to add in? Okay. Chapter 14, we'll do a little bit just to be able to answer questions about his mom's influence on Samson as an adult. We see him in chapter 14. He's old enough to get married. He's out traveling in the area around his hometown and sees a Philistine girl. And based on the text, he sees her and says, that's the one I want to marry. She looks good to me. And so he goes and tells his parents, I saw a girl and she's beautiful and I want you to go and get her for me that I could marry her. What's the reaction from Samson's parents to this request? Okay, so their advice here, and it's not because she's not from their hometown, it's because she's a Philistine. And their advice as parents, and they're together in this, is you'd be better off finding one of God's people, one of our relatives, a child of God, an Israelite, and not this Philistine girl. And how does he take this advice? Yeah, he doesn't care about that. He wants the one that looks good to him. Go get her for me. He sounds in the text, the way it's presented here, like he's kind of a spoiled child. I want that. Go get it for me. I want it. That's what I want. And he's going apparently based on looks, according to how the scripture plays out. Okay. So we'll stop there. Just note one more thing. It says in verse 4 of chapter 14, God was using this opportunity to start the deliverance from the Philistines. Now, when God gave the charter, essentially, I'm going to call it that, for Samson, it wasn't to deliver God's people from the Philistines. It was to begin a delivery from the Philistines. So this is not going to be a complete conquest of the Philistines. That'll happen when David's king. But this is starting a process. At the time, of course, Samson's parents didn't know that's what this was. They don't see this as an opportunity for Samson to have conflict with the Philistines. They just see it as their son making a bad choice. At the time the story takes place, the Philistines had already subdued the Israelites, and the Philistines and the Jews were living together. There was this uneasy peace between them where they had commerce with each other. Apparently, they even intermarried. But there was certainly a role the Philistines played of superiority to the Israelites here. And so it's really an unusual situation to be living among your enemies, and that's what we have here. Okay. Anything else to add from that little bit of chapter 14? Just the facts. Okay, so let's go through on the table and answer some questions. There's two columns there. The first column is about Manoah's influence on Manoah's wife's influence on Manoah, and it's based on just a couple verses at the end of chapter 13. But let's answer the questions and see if we can't get anything of value from this story. Relationship with the influenced individual. Yeah, husband and wife. Was the relationship between the two long-term or short-term? Long-term. Overall result of the influence in this instance, was it positive or negative? Okay, I'm going to say positive, and we'll get down to exactly what she did that was, I think, positive. How did she influence her husband? Okay, and let me just clarify. We are talking about what happened at the end of the story, verses 21 through 23. kind of specific. Yeah, in this instance, she exerted her influence over her husband with logic, is what I heard. Um, she just seems to me, she just talked to him. He was, I'm going to say, freaking out from what had just occurred, and she's just talking him through this. And that's the method of influence here. What was the impact of that influence? It was positive, but what happened as a result of? Okay, she's going to give birth to a son. There's no immediate indication in the scripture that when she said these things to him about if God wanted to kill us, he already would have. And besides, why would God kill us if he'd given us this task? We don't see that, oh, at that point, he snapped out of it and they carried on and made preparations for the son. But we can imagine that the impact of her logic on him was to calm him. I mean, when, husband and wives, sometimes one of us gets overwhelmed at times, and the other partner can have a very calming influence on the other if you're aware enough to do that. And the impact or the result is, as a husband and wife team, we're able to just move on and get past these difficulties. And I think here what we have is Manoah's personality was that of somebody who was anxious or who worried a lot, based on what little piece about the relationship we do see. And it seems like Manoah's wife was a little bit more steady, and she was able to explain things or to have this calming influence. And I mean, it's a little bit of speculation, but it's also based, I think, on the text and what we see as his personality trait of always, I need to know more. What's going to happen next? What are we supposed to do with this child? What's his job supposed to be? He also seems perhaps a little bit concerned or a little bit anxious about the angel or the messenger keeps coming to his wife and not coming to him. And again, speculation. Husbands are the head of the wife, even more obvious back at this time. And it seems like this angel keeps breaking the chain of command and going talking to his wife instead of talking to him. So he may have had a lot of issues and a lot of concerns, anxieties, and it seems like she's the calming, steadying influence in this relationship. And of course, the value of that is really, really important because husbands and wives go through all kinds of challenges. And to have a steadying influence of a wife can be really, really valuable.
You could also look at it this way. He was married, he had a concern for his wife. Maybe he was just going the extra mile and had God be concerned enough to want to know, men are the protection. You people around. Something like he watched it over his situation, his situation. So it's very different.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are overprotective. We want to ask our questions. But my daughter, I want to know who was I was there.
Yeah.
So that's the situation. But it does show that the wife, a good wife, will provide that additional comfort that does call.
Okay. So Ricardo points out that his anxiety may have been related to his concern for his wife and certainly their future, and that's true. Yeah. Yeah, they had something special going on here, and he may have been just concerned that he wanted to get it right. Yeah, he's not chastised for wanting more information. He just didn't get it. So, okay. Was the influence a result of a conscious effort? Yeah, she speaks to him face to face. She's intending to, I think, to calm him. Was this instance part of a larger pattern? One of these stories we just don't know enough about the relationship. So I put unknown there. Was he aware of the effort to influence? Yeah, she was talking to him face to face. I don't think he was. Uh, there was anything going on behind his back here. Would they have been better off or worse off without the influence? Hmm? Better off if she had not tried to calm him? He would be better off if she did not try to calm him? But yeah, I know. With yes, yes, okay, right. That he's better off. What would have been, again, speculation here? What would have been the result without the influence if she hadn't attempted to calm him here? Well, I can't see that anything horrific would have happened. It's not like he was on the verge of sinning or doing anything drastic. Uh, but again, he may have been temporarily unable to do anything productive. If he's expecting God to kill him at any moment, he's in danger here. Then we don't know what his uh, actions would have been, but what little we do have available to us is she calms him at this point. Any takeaways from this bit of a piece of a story? Anything we can use? Okay. Careful who you seek advice from. Okay. And we're about to get to that. We'll do that. We're about to go to a column with Samson and how his mom influenced him. And we should probably move on to that really quickly because we're running out of time. Because I do want to talk about that point precisely. What about anything to take away from Manoah and his wife, those two? Anything else? Shannon thinks they're good parents trying to do a good job. One takeaway I put down is just here the importance of a calming influence. And wives have a unique opportunity to influence their husband that way. Husbands and wives get into periods where they're just overwhelmed. And when you're overwhelmed, you tend to not act. And so the wife here, I think, is just kind of resetting Manoah. Okay, we're going to be okay. God has given us this mission, and we're just going to go and move on from here and not be stuck in this indecision, fear, and not able to act productively. Eric?
Sometimes statement is made go, women are just emotional, or sometimes they can biological.
Right.
I think this is a good example. I can even see this in my own life sometimes. Sometimes men get too wrapped up in logical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it takes a lifetime to break them out of that.
Right.
So I think we need to recognize that. It's not just purely binary. If they're purely emotional, they can't think straight. No.
Yep.
There are times when they can be emotional, but men also can remember that ironically, when you think you're applying logic, it's really emotion.
Yeah.
It's blind and confused.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a stereotype to say that women are emotional and men are logical, but the reality is there's a lot of range of that in a marriage. And certainly here, this is an example of the wife being the one to be logical and to help her husband get past his emotional response. Okay. All right, let's move over to talk about Samson and his mom's influence on him. So on the table, the relationship between the two, mother and son. Was the relationship between the two long-term, short-term? Obviously long-term. Overall result in this instant. Now we're talking about the first 10 verses of chapter 14. In this instance, was the overall result positive or negative? You can actually answer this different ways. Okay.
So they saw it as they, as a parent, looks like he's wrong that he's not wanting to choose. What if you're not teaching him? He's wanting to make the enemy
Yeah.
black and white.
So negative in the sense that they're trying to give him some wise counsel, and he's not listening. Okay. Anything positive about this?
The fact that it's from
Yeah, the fact that it's yeah, and in this instance, God had a use for Samson, and that's going to occur, but the parents had no idea about this instance and how this was going to play out. Um, it was negative for Samson. This is going to work out really poorly here, and it could have been avoided if he had listened to his parents. What was the method of influence in this case? How did Manoah and his wife try to influence their son? Reasoning? Okay. Yeah. So that's all we have here is that it was reasoning. They were just talking to their son, trying to offer good advice. Is logic going to be useful in this instance? No, because he's not acting out of logic. Is he? What's he acting out of? Lust, passion, seems to be. And so, parents may have certain tools at their disposal. We're gonna work our way through this with logic, but it doesn't always work with a child who's even a grown child who's making a decision not based on logic. Was the influence a result of a conscious effort? Yes, it was. I skipped one. What's the impact of the influence? How impactful were they here? Yeah, there was none. Yeah, he didn't listen to his parents. He put aside their counsel. Was this instance part of a larger pattern of influence? We have any more examples in the text about his parents trying to influencing him and being ineffective? This is really the first and only instance we get in his life where his parents were shown trying. So there's no pattern that we could see here. Was he aware of their efforts to influence him? Absolutely. Very upfront, trying to be like good parents and give some wise counsel. Would Samson have been better off or worse off without the influence? Well, considering he doesn't listen, it doesn't matter. And there's not an easy answer to that one. So let's speculate. What would have been the result without the influence? If they had said nothing, would it changed anything here? Considering that he didn't take the advice, likely not. Okay, so then what's the takeaway from this story? What kind of things do we learn about the influence of a mom in this case? And Tia says that once they're grown, they'll make their own decisions, and we can't always change their mind. Okay. Is this a failure here? Did Manoah and his wife do something wrong or present to us a bad example to follow? We're not aware of any failures here. We don't get any information about Samson growing as a child. We do know that to this point, according to God's plan, things are still going according to the plan. We don't get any other picture about how they raised him, what they taught him. But so far, what we've seen about his parents are they go to God in prayer, they're offering sacrifices, they seem to be doing the kinds of things that God would expect parents to do, and they're trying to give wise counsel to their son. Rob? Mm-hmm. Right. The name's kind of an expectation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so that all makes sense. It's from what we can gather, his parents were doing the right things, and yet their son, as a grown man, ignores their advice. Okay, and so I guess one of the takeaways is, you know, we do what we can as parents and try to provide uh, an upbringing in accordance with God's will. And at some point, kids are going to be on their own, and they may totally ignore what we've advised them to do. And that's just a reality of how God has made us, each with our own individual um, will and ability to choose. And so this is really just to point out the limitations of influence. Because the parents were united in this counsel to their son. It wasn't like, one parent was telling him to do one thing, the other parent, it seems like the parents were together in this, and he just went off and did his own thing. So that's a takeaway, is moms, no matter how good you are, you can't make the choices for your children. So we do what we can to maximize our influence, and even then, it's not going to be 100% foolproof. Any other takeaways somebody would like to add? Let's move on, because we're almost out of time, to the next sheet, which is Samson's fiance. Same woman. I'll summarize real quickly the facts of the story. It's a familiar story. He's on his way to see this girl, and from the text, it appears to make this proposal, and a lion attacks him. He kills a lion with his hands and just continues on his journey. They get engaged. At some point later, he's coming back for the wedding feast, which, if it's a typical engagement from this period, it's about a year from the time they're engaged until the wedding feast. So like a year later, he's coming back, same road, sees the lion, it's dead. Its carcass is now holding some wild bees and honey. He gets the honey out, shares the honey. He doesn't explain to anybody where the honey came from. And at the wedding feast, it's this week-long event. And because the bride is a Philistine bride, the whole bride party are Philistines. And Samson, in the first day of the feast, proposes a riddle, and it's kind of a wager. And he words this story such that it's unclear as to where the honey came from, and it's just like a typical, really, vague riddle. And he gives them a week to come up with the answer. There's a lot of expensive garments on the line. If Samson wins, he'll get 30 sets of garments. If he loses, he provides 30 sets. And so the Philistines have no idea what the answer to the riddle is. And there's no real way for them to figure this out. Only Samson could know the answer. So after 3 days of them coming up with nothing, they threaten the bride and say, "We'll burn you and your family if you don't get the answer for us from him." So that starts the next 4 days of her coming to Samson crying. Says, "If you really loved me, you would share the answer. You must really hate me because you're keeping this information from me." And so this persists. And at first he says, "I haven't even told my parents this. I'm not telling anybody." And she comes to him every day, and it must be a miserable week for him, with this weeping bride that's constantly saying, "You don't really love me." And on the last day, he tells her the answer, and she immediately tells the Philistines, and they give the answer. And Samson is so enraged to have lost, he leaves the wedding feast, goes to another village, kills 30 Philistines, takes their garments, and he pays his debt with what he's just taken from these Philistines. The bride is then given to someone else to marry. It says a friend of Samson. And that's the end of this sad little story. Okay. Any other facts we should pick up before we answer some questions? Oh, he insults his bride when he finds out they get the answer. And what is his quote? "If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you would not have known the answer." It's a unique statement. But essentially what he's saying there is he's aware that they used his wife against him. And at that point, we don't know if he's just done with her and that's why she's given to marry somebody else, or maybe his reaction of leaving causes them to find someone else for her to marry. But it's just really sad. Right. Yeah. He goes back to his parents' house after this. Yeah. Um, in the commentaries, they point out that it wasn't just given to somebody else; it was given to she was given to a Philistine. I don't get that from the text, but that's what they seem to agree that someone in this Philistine bridal party, one of the 30, got her, and it just further creates this bad feeling between Samson and the Philistines that's going to perpetuate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he's going to move on to Delilah next, and at least that we're aware of. A lot of harlots before then, and we'll get to her next week. So let's answer some questions. We have about 5 minutes. The relationship between the two. Yeah, this is an engagement. Was the relationship between the two long-term, short-term? Short-term. Okay, maybe a year at most, we think. Overall result of her influence on Samson, positive or negative? Negative here. What was a method she used? Crying. Okay, that was part of it. What else? Emotional. Whiny. Okay. You think if she had come to him, if she had come to Samson and said that she had been threatened, would it have changed things? Possibly. I would have thought that was a better option, but that's not what she picked. Laverne? So Laverne thinks that she was more loyal to the Philistines than she was to Samson. Is that surprising? I mean, it makes sense in this culture that that's her family, you know. So it's not that married couples can't overcome those kind of things, but here it was certainly more than they could overcome. Um, that's right. It seems like this is all superficial, and it never developed into anything other than that. So her choice here was to play on the emotional response, and it wasn't just the crying and the guilt about you didn't really love me, you don't really love me, but it was the persistence as well. She just kept on day after day for 4 days, it says. And so, was it effective? It was here. Is it effective long term? If this hadn't turned out in the death of 30 people, can you sustain a relationship and sustain your influence by using this method? People try, but I think this kind of thing, it wears out after a while. So I don't know that this is a good model for being influential. And that's one of the things we're going to look at as we move on is some things work, but they may not work over time. And I think this kind of thing, it's just don't really love me. You know, if this is the second week of the marriage, and you know he's going to go visit a friend. If you wouldn't visit a friend, you don't really love me. I mean, this kind of thing keeps going. Eventually, you tune it out. But it certainly worked for the one time, and that's all she really needed. Turns out. Was it part of a larger pattern? We just don't know. Was he aware of the efforts to influence? He is. In fact, he's even aware of how the Philistines came to know the answer. His response to them about if they had not plowed with his heifer. He knows exactly what's happened here. Would he have been better off without her influence? Okay, yes, from James. So speculation here. What would have been the result without the influence? if she didn't intervene here, what would have happened? We're out of time. Okay. Okay. So Samson wins the bet without her influence. They could have followed through with the threat to kill her. That's possible. But he's also then married with a lousy wife as a result here. Okay, quick. What a couple takeaways. Anyone got any takeaways from this? What's that, Anna? Listen to your parents. Okay, yeah, they were right on this one. Looks are not everything. Great. What about use of influence here, Rob? Yep. Yeah. Well, that's true. That's true. Someone else had something? Okay, real quick. So, women can influence with emotion and persistence, and that probably has its place. In fact, Samson did something here that he knew he shouldn't do. It overcame his better judgment to reveal this, plus his pride. He had this riddle that was foolproof, and he allowed himself to just let that go. So the emotional is very effective. Persistence is effective, but it may not work long term. Okay, so all right, we're out of time. We'll do the lesson on Delilah for next Sunday. Thank y'all.